Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's Sparring Partners webinar on the best way to bring broadband to rural USA. Our speakers today are Claude Aiken, Chief Strategy Officer and Chief Legal Officer at Nextlink Internet, and Monica Paolini, Principal at Sensafili. I'm Kendra Chamberlain, and I will be moderating our webinar today. In Sparring Partners webinars, we watch our debaters discuss a topic live on video. We'd like to encourage our audience to participate in the conversation. Please share your comments and questions using the chat function on the Zoom taskbar. All comments are visible to all participants, so please keep the conversation polite and respectful. Our speakers will do their best to address questions as they go along and as they become relevant to the topics being discussed. So please do not hold your questions until the end. And with that, I'll hand it over to Monica.
Kendra, thanks so much for the introduction, and Claude, thanks for being with us today, and those of you in the audience. This is a topic that we have not, I believe, talked about in Sparring Partners before, and it's really sort of due because not only there is a lot of interest, it's a very important topic to talk about. And what I would like to do, what Claude and I talk about doing, is to really talk about sort of, how can I say, the first principle. So we're not going to necessarily go into the details of how to get funded, what's the best way, or what are the programs and all of that, which is kind of hairy stuff. But to talk about what is driving, what is that it's working, what is that it's not working, what are the difficulties beyond funding, or the challenges and the opportunities at the same time, because there is a lot that it's sort of not specific to a program, but it's more like, how do we think about it? What is the best way? Because we can get marred in the details of who got more or less money, but the question is, for a country, what is best for the country? What is best for those rural communities that do not have good broadband? So with that said, I would like Claude to tell us who he is. And the reason why I'm very happy to talk to Claude is because he has the whole 360-degree core competencies in all this, because he's been working on from the FCC, organizations, service providers. So he has seen it all from different perspectives. That is really important. So Claude, tell us exactly who you are, what you're doing, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, thank you, Monica, and really appreciate you having me on, and looking forward to our conversation. So yeah, Claude Aiken, I am Chief Strategy Officer and Chief Legal Officer at Nextlink Internet, which is a premier provider of fiber and fixed wireless internet in rural areas, going into about 12 states now, so across the Midwestern United States. So a little bit about me, current role, I handle all of our legal, government affairs, strategic partnerships, things of that nature. My background immediately before this is I was the CEO of the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, or WISPA. And before that, I spent about a decade at the FCC in a variety of capacities, from advising a couple of the political appointees to holding senior leadership roles throughout the FCC. And then I actually started out there as a baby attorney right out of law school. Longer ago than I am willing to admit. So I'll stop there and we can get into the conversation.
No, absolutely. And this is really important, because you really need to understand the overall part, because when you get to rural coverage, no matter how efficient you are as a service provider, you do need to have help in terms of subsidies, in terms of from the government, state, or somebody, because it's often, in most locations, it's very hard to make a business case that is self-sufficient. So there is a sense in which, it's very different than if you are building or providing service in an urban area. Now, let's just start from the basics, as we often do in Sparring Partners, and define what's broadband and what's rural. Now let's say what is rural first. I mean, how low density, what is that you are targeting?
Yeah, and it's interesting because there are a lot of different definitions out there of what's rural, right? I think USDA, if you go to their website, they have a whole series of gradations of what's considered rural in a variety of different contexts. That can include small towns, that can include rural countryside. But when you're talking about the economics of rural broadband deployment, it really kind of comes down to a trade-off between the amount of potential customers in an area versus the needed capital to deploy, regardless of where that's coming from. Excuse me. And for private capital, if you're deploying a technology that has less expensive CapEx, you're probably able to get into areas that have fewer passings per mile or fewer homes per square mile than if you're trying to use a more expensive technology to deploy. So it's really kind of dependent on the technology, the density, and a variety of other factors to determine how you approach this problem from a service provider mindset, from a policymaker mindset. And then I think the other thing you asked is what is broadband? And I think the FCC has a definition that I think pretty well encapsulates it, which is it's a mass market retail service by wire or radio that allows you to access all or substantially all internet endpoints. And that's basically what we're talking about here. Your ability to connect to the internet in a way that's kind of beyond dial-up per the definition, but I think we're pretty far beyond dial-up right now. And I think that's at a high level what we're talking about. We can delve into more specifics later, but I think that's some decent table setting at least.
Now, okay, so first of all, I think that's very helpful to think about rural is not just the number of residential or homes or businesses per square mile. It's way more than that. I mean, it's more complex. And that's just sort of thing that this is important because it's not just number of, just not density. It's where you are within that. But now broadband, now, it's usually like, it's the throughput, right? But what about latency, packet loss? Because those are actually very important for maybe I'm just sort of like, when you try to characterize service, there is more than just throughput, right?
No, absolutely. And I would say actually that I think throughput has been the historical focus. We've got to get more and more throughput to more and more people. And some of the other characteristics around broadband service have actually become more important than throughput at this point, because I mean, it used to be that a high definition 4K video stream, when it first came out, took a lot of megabits to be able to watch it, and streaming video continues to be the largest driver of bandwidth consumption across the ecosystem today. But we've seen advances in video compression technology that have allowed us to kind of compress that down into as low as 10 to 15 megabits per second requirement to be able to do true 4K streaming video. But then things like latency and packet loss for gaming, for real-time video, two-way video, those are things that are becoming more important, and from a public policy perspective matter too, right? So if one of your goals is real-time remote learning or real-time telehealth, you can probably do that over a couple, 5 to 10 megabit video stream each way. but you're going to lose the quality of that experience if your packet loss and your latency are too high.
So do you think that that should be included when you know, the FCC, when you sort of in the definition of broadband, to have some sort of latency, or is it like,
You know, that it is to some extent included, at least in some of the funding programs that are out there right now. There does seem to be sort of a recognition that you need latency below say 100 milliseconds in order to be able to do a lot of the things that we understand that we need to do in using a broadband connection. So for example, in the FCC's Connect America Fund and Rural Digital Opportunity Fund programs, there were differences in the categories of bidding, whether you were below a certain latency threshold or not. So I think that there is recognition that needs to be a part of the conversation, you know, sometimes even above and beyond the bandwidth capabilities of the network. But I think there still continues to be a focus on technology and a focus on throughput above and beyond some of those other tertiary factors.
Now, another sort of general question, I can go a little bit deeper.
Sure.
When we talk about broadband, we assume that it's a fixed broadband to the home. But
Sure.
A lot of people, I guess that might not work very well in rural areas because cellular coverage is also not very good. But in urban areas or more dense areas, some people do not feel that they need a fixed connection to the home because cellular is good enough. And so does it make sense to sort of separate the two and track the two separately, which is what we basically do? So let's say you are in a rural environment, you have a very good 5G connection. Well, maybe that's all there is. That's all you need. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and you hit on a good point there, because there's kind of been an ongoing debate on how you deal with the mobile versus fixed piece. And I would say that as mobile networks have continued to improve, and you have generations that are more on their phones than on their tablets or computers, that seems to be a direction that the market seems to go. But when you're talking about things like latency, like throughput, like packet loss, that fixed connection to the home still offers a better quality of experience and a consistent quality of experience over time. And you can kind of see that in the way that mobile providers are looking at the fixed market and utilizing their infrastructure to deploy their version of fixed wireless access, which is a little bit different from what you see from the traditional WISP market in terms of fixed wireless access and how it's deployed. But I think you see a recognition in the mobile space that it is a different product now, whether that's because there's additional revenue to be had from selling a separate product. You know, that remains to be seen, but we have seen significant consumer demand for that additional product above and beyond the mobile product. And you've seen that on earnings calls from a couple of the big mobile players, and that certainly seems to be a newer dynamic in the market.
Well, and also, I guess, on the other hand, if you have good residential fixed service, you can use Wi-Fi calling or whatever, so your phone works. So that makes up for the fact that your phone, you might not have very good cellular service where you live if you're in a rural area.
No, absolutely, and that's a huge thing. I mean, the large majority of traffic that travels over a mobile device travels over your Wi-Fi connection at home by orders of magnitude. So that's a good point.
Yeah, and that's a point that it's often forgotten. You know, which is not to say that you're gonna, don't need cellular coverage because you don't stay at home all day, but it is a big offload for operators. So it's very. So I see we have a question, but I would just wait for a second to get to that. And all of you in the audience, I see there is a lot of the regular ones, but either we're regular or not, do ask questions as we go along, because there is no Q&A at the end. So ask your questions as they come to your mind. So maybe you can give us a little bit of a sort of high level view. So, if we look recently, what happened, there's much more interest in bridging the digital divide. There is more funds, and there is more attention. How do you see that going? I mean, obviously that should be good news for you, but how is that? What's your view of the sort of the long-term evolution?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I kind of think back to 10, 15 years ago when broadband was still seen amongst some as a luxury good, right? And you had leading policymakers effectively making that point. Well, this is not really a necessity. And then you have COVID come along, and you have millions upon millions of people trying to work from home and do exactly what we're doing today, having these virtual conversations over two-way streaming video. And man, if you don't have broadband at home, you are going to have an incredibly challenging time working from home, learning from home, doing telehealth, all of the uses that we see beyond kind of the entertainment streaming video that are really sort of core public policy goals, which then I think has driven a lot of the discussion in the public space about, we need to have historic generational funding to really close this digital divide once and for all. And I think there are, you can kind of quibble about how that's been done historically, how that's going to happen in the future. But if you're kind of looking at the broad arc of what was the huge catalyzing force behind this really historic focus on rural broadband and on broadband in general, where you have, the President of the United States and the Secretary of Commerce mentioning that regularly, right, as part of their focus on bringing up the infrastructure of the United States. That's something that really hasn't happened before the recent past.
Yeah, I guess that now we start seeing broadband connectivity to be like a basic feature. So, if you build a home, or if you have a home, you expect to have water, electricity. Right. No matter where you are, and otherwise, well, okay, maybe there are some exceptions to that. But actually, let me ask you about the exceptions, because, okay, so before I ask you about what is rural, I mean, there is a point in which it's more rural than rural. So you might decide to live in a very isolated place. So when we talk about rural, is there some exclusion where if you really, really are outside, you're sort of beyond rural?
Yeah, I think the water is an interesting analogy, right? Because you have if you live in a dense enough area, you typically have underwater, underground water and sewage. And if you move a little bit further out, then you might have to have septic, because you don't have sewage access. And if you move even further out, you might have to have well. And if you're on, as I visited years ago on tribal nations, you may actually have to, load up water in a truck and drive it out to where you live. So there's different gradations, kind of like I was talking about at the beginning. There's sort of different gradations of rural and different gradations of infrastructure access to access something that's, I think in the United States especially, we would consider to be sort of a basic need. And now I don't know whether people will call the water company first or will call their internet provider first to get their new home hooked up. You can kind of debate about whether you go, electricity, water, internet. but it certainly has ascended to that level of importance in terms of being able to figure out, are you going to be able to live here and have the infrastructure necessary to be able to conduct life in the 21st century?
Absolutely. Well, I guess that with broadband, there is the advantage that you can always use satellite to get a basic. So it's like having something which is different from having, say, sewage, or, sewage can't really have.
Right.
Yeah. Why don't we go to some of the questions from the audience? There's a question from Brad, and he's talking about technological neutrality. And so, and it talks about NTIA breaking the law. And so if I might kind of rephrase the question to provide a little bit of context here, I think that, so there's a lot of funding available from the government, and the funding is going to provide broadband connectivity to people in rural areas. But you can do that basically by fiber or wireless or satellite. There are different ways to go about it. And so the question is, how should that funding be allocated? And here the assumption, I think, is like, so Brad talks about the unwarranted prejudice against wireless. And this is because of all the application, well, all the federal agencies seem to have sorry about this, a preference for sorry, I cannot do this.
No, you're fine.
Yeah. So, sorry, I'm back. They cannot, well, they seem to have a preference for fiber for some obvious reasons and some less obvious reasons. And so the question is, okay, so what is your view on that? And then we can dig deeper.
Sure.
And,
so, yeah, I think it's, again, it's interesting because, in terms of my history in this industry, I think back to, over a decade ago where some of the conversations in the public policy space were like, that fixed internet, that, fiber DSL, that's kind of the boring stuff. We're really excited about what wireless can do. And now the pendulum seems to have swung back the other direction to really focus on, well, let's drive this particular type of infrastructure as far as it can go. And I think that creates a challenge, right? There are certain policy cuts that have been made in some of these funding programs. You had the IIJA that passed and was, there was language in there that was very technology neutral. The NTIA, in its implementation of that, decided to implement a fairly strong fiber preference. And I think what Brett is talking about is there was a particular policy cut that effectively said that areas that are served with unlicensed wireless are considered unserved and thus eligible for funding. And that's very impactful for a lot of smaller rural providers who have built their networks on unlicensed spectrum and have provided quality service for decades to folks in rural America, and are now effectively being told that they don't show up on the map, which is obviously pretty concerning. I mean, even us at Nextlink, we have a significant chunk of unlicensed coverage that now, according to federal public policy, all those customers that we've been serving don't exist. So I think that's some of the tension that you see in the policy choices that have been made, where you have customers who may be getting 100 megabit, 200 megabit service in these areas utilizing unlicensed spectrum, who are now considered unserved for the purposes of these funding programs.
So what is your personal view on that, and in this, or the next view, in terms of there's just so much funding that we have. I mean, that either is allocated or we can allocate, that we can throw out a problem. And clearly you cannot build fiber to everybody.
Right.
And we're going to get to Brett's question afterwards, which is addresses that question. But some of the fiber proponents see fixed wireless access to be just something, it's a temporary solution. And then you have to do fiber anyway. So their argument is, well, might as well do fiber from the beginning so that you don't have this this interim solution. What is your view on the relationship between fiber and wireless? Because clearly having fiber, if I give you a choice at home, do you rather have fiber or wireless? Everybody say, well, other things being equal, I'd rather have fiber.
Sure.
That's just, but the question is that's not the reality, right?
No, it's true. And I would rather have a Ferrari than a Jeep, right? So all other things being equal. So I think it's, once you kind of peel the onion back on some of the talking points and you kind of get down to what the economics are of what we're talking about, kind of like we were talking about with water infrastructure, right? Or road infrastructure. We don't build 4-lane highways to every rural household. We don't build sewer infrastructure to every mountaintop. I think there has to be some balancing between what the private sector and what the government is willing to spend versus the outcomes that it wants to achieve. And I don't think wireless is a stopgap solution. I think it has shown to provide high quality service for many years. I think we talk a lot more about fixed wireless now because a lot of the larger players are marketing that as a service and are gaining customers in that way. Whereas this was historically somewhat of a more niche market focused on rural areas. But I think all technologies certainly have a role to play. I mean, if we could deploy fiber everywhere, I think we could. I think the price tag in terms of private and public sector capital as well as time, right? That's another big barrier that you see with fiber. We can stand up a tower and be able to cover several hundred households in a pretty rural area within a matter of a couple of months, as opposed to a couple of years that would take fiber to get to everybody. So there are certainly puts and takes to different technologies that get muddled, I think, by some of the talking points that are out there.
Now, satellite is another thing. It used to be much more expensive, much slower. Latency was a major issue, but it got to a point where it is actually better. And I would say that would qualify as broadband connectivity. So as you go more and more rural, couldn't we just skip the sort of the funding for building the infrastructure and have those people use satellite? And my understanding is that in the maps, and I mean that satellite is not considered basically broadband.
Correct.
You think that that's right? And what's the deal there? How should we think about it?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, right? Because kind of like we were talking about at the top, what are the, once you get down below the very high level definition of what broadband is, I think what more people are concerned about is, does this connection allow me to do what I want to do? Does it allow me to stream video? Does it allow me to do gaming, to do voice, to do two-way video, all of those things? And I think historically, at least the like geostationary satellite, just the physics of the latency have made some of those use cases very difficult, which is why, again, I think it comes back to the public policy cuts that have effectively said that doesn't count. Different thinking behind the public policy cuts that say, unlicensed fixed wireless doesn't count, even though it meets some of these other service metrics. But I think that's the struggle, that when you're talking about public funding, there are certain criteria that policymakers want to say to ensure we meet, to be able to say, yes, this has been a successful use of public funding to get infrastructure out there. And when you, especially for the historical geo satellites, where you have hardwired, for lack of a better term, characteristics that make it challenging to do certain use cases, that makes it challenging from a policymaker standpoint to say, yes, this should count. We should put funding towards that. Now, I think with some of the newer constellations that are low Earth orbit, where some of the latency considerations are mitigated to some extent, that's a different conversation. But again, that's still relatively new. It's still somewhat in beta, so difficult to say how that's going to work for longer term, just from a capacity standpoint, from a price standpoint, from a variety of standpoints. So I think the summing it up, I think the answer is a qualified yes, but I think I can see why, from a public policy perspective, there have been made certain cuts that way.
Yeah, and I guess that eventually you want to have as much fiber as you can, as much fixed wireless, and use satellite where you cannot do anything else, really. I mean, or in special cases, although I might be proven wrong. But anyway, so let's go back to the question. So there is a question from Canada. I would like to, Ken has been a guest in Sparring Partners. I would like to get to that one in a little bit later, but let's get to the questions from Gerald and Brad. So Gerald asked if there is, if you have a multifamily type of buildings, so you might be able to get funding to get to the building, but not for in-building coverage. Now, I would imagine there's not that many multi-building type of situations in rural areas, but is that something that it's covered or not? And then there is the other question from Brad that I wanted to ask you as well, and he is a wireless ISP, and I know that you can read it, but for the recorded version, I'm going to read it so that everybody can see it when they listen to it. And this is the question about providing subsidies to reach what he calls the prairie mansions, which is basically, I can go out and buy this huge tract of land and build my fancy home and say, oh, I have no broadband. And you expect the government to build broadband to you, but really if you have the money to build that kind of thing, you should be able to basically pay for your own broadband connection, right? So how do we think about it? I mean, at which point you say, yes, you deserve, like in some areas, some rural users deserve to be assisted, and others that are, you say, well, if your home is worth more than X, you don't deserve. I mean, that becomes really tricky as well. So how do we navigate that kind of issue?
Yeah, I think the structure that the NTIA came up with in the BEAD program, it's one way of addressing this, right? So if there is an extremely high cost location, so think of that prairie mansion, so to speak, and it would cost $1 million just to run fiber out to the mansion. In all circumstances, that's going to go above that threshold, and a state, in order to say how are we going to use our money to say that home is served, are going to have to look at different technologies, different methods of getting there. there were some discussions years ago about means testing some universal service funding that ultimately I don't think gained a lot of traction, particularly because it's so difficult to do, right? If you're talking about income-based universal service funding, that's certainly a challenging topic, both politically and also data-wise, in terms of who is eligible and what locations are eligible for what levels of funding. So I think that's kind of the challenge, and I think the structure that the NTIA came up with is a structure that makes some sense. We still don't know exactly where each state is going to set that threshold, where they're going to consider alternative technologies other than fiber to serve those locations. But that's kind of the state of the debate right now. And then I think for the other question about multifamily properties, it's not really part of the kind of the current programs that everybody's talking about, but depending on the location and the status, there may be some alternative funding programs that maybe that particular property is eligible, maybe from HUD, maybe from a state economic development agency, but it's not a part of sort of the big picture federal programs that we're talking about right now.
Is that something that you see in your markets, that is a problem, that you can get to the building, but then?
Yeah, that's a whole separate issue, right? Because usually there is some incumbent in that building, and there may be some exclusive marketing, exclusive access type arrangements that makes it difficult for a competitor to come in and run cabling or get access to the facilities in order to provide a competitive service, which is an issue that the FCC has begun to address a little bit more historically. So difficult to say what kind of funding programs may be out there for that, but it certainly is a competitive issue that policymakers have been looking at.
Now, I see that there are a bunch of questions about like the war has started. Is it fiber, satellite, or wireless? What's best and what's not? I would like to stay out of that, in the sense that clearly you can have a situation where wireless is better than fiber, or satellite is better than fiber. I mean,
sure.
you can imagine, but in general, I think we could say, I think safely, that fiber typically is better than wireless and better than satellite, other things being equal. Clearly, is there anything else that we should keep into account? And also that fiber is more expensive than the other solutions. Generally speaking, if you happen to have a home which is just right where fiber is, then fiber is actually cheaper than wireless. So you could go both ways.
Yeah, it's challenging, right? Because you see, kind of going back to what we were talking about with mobile provider based fixed wireless access, and a lot of the customers that some of the big mobile providers are gaining are in areas that have fiber or have upgraded cable networks that are capable of providing high speeds. So it's, at the end of the day, it's not necessarily about the technology, but it's about, can the technology meet the consumer needs at a price, and we haven't even talked about affordability yet, that a price that the consumer is willing to pay for the service. So kind of going back to sort of the Ferrari thing, I'm sure I would take a Ferrari. I can't use it fully because of the speed limits around the roads where I'm at. And so I think that's why the conversation is so much more complex than this. Just in terms of, you can get a quality of experience that over fixed wireless that will match that of fiber. if it's a well-run network. And you can probably get it faster, more affordably, and in a way that kind of meets your needs. So that's why these debates are so complex.
Yeah, and I think that affordability is the other issue, because let's say you go into a rural area, and in rural areas, typically the income, whatever it's lower than in other areas. So yes, there are the mansions, but most of the people don't live in mansions, and so you might be able to build this absolutely top performance network, but then you have to charge people for it. So I think that that's also something that we sometimes forget. So if you keep the cost down, then obviously you can afford to offer a service that maybe is not as good, but it's more affordable. And as you say, your goal is to serve the people, not to build the highway, so to say.
Right.
So this is really important. Now, there is another question here that I would like to ask, and sort of frame it a little bit, which is about the multiple funding programs from different agencies. Everybody has different rules, and I have to confess that, well, I'm not applying for any of that, but every time you try to figure out, to make sense of it, you get this sense of like helplessness, like, oh my God, there's this, and this, and how does this relate to that? It's just like an absolute nightmare. And I'm sure that, well, you work on it full time, so you probably know how to navigate, but especially for small providers, it has to be really complicated. And also, I guess that the problem, which is, it's not just the simplicity, but it also the clarity, because once you have all those programs, it's not clear what the big picture is. How is that? Is the government helping? So if you look at, like there was rip and replace, the different, so it's sort of more difficult to evaluate how helpful all of this is. So what do you think it's the best? Well, the other thing is that now we have, with the latest round of funding, we have states that are going to allocate funding. And maybe we can comment on that, because that's another different thing. Is that the best way to go? So maybe you can comment on this. Does the framework, is the framework working? Is it just too complicated, or is it complicated because you cannot do otherwise?
Well, I think I would wholeheartedly agree that it is complicated. I mean, you have multiple federal programs, and beyond the big headline ones at NTIA, USDA, FCC, you have 15, 20 other broadband related programs that are run through other federal, regional commissions, other agencies that have a niche focus on broadband. And then you layer on, as you were mentioning, all of the different state programs. Now, some of these are related to the NTIA or to the Department of Treasury funding, but states have also recognized that broadband is a need in their rural areas. So some have stood up their own state funding programs apart from their historic telephone funding programs to focus on broadband. So, and then layer on top of that, you have some counties or municipalities that are saying, well, we really want to improve broadband in our locality. We're going to throw some of our own funding at this as well. So navigating all of these different funding efforts can be quite a challenge, even for somebody who is focused on this space. Would it be simpler if there was just one mechanism? Absolutely. But I think what I would really like to see is strong coordination between all of these and streamlining, so that we have all of the goals of all of these rowing in the same direction, at least at the federal level, right? So and you see some movement towards that, but making sure that what the FCC is funding, what the USDA is funding, what the NTA and other programs are funding are at the same baseline criteria and are generally looking to achieve the same sort of goals, so that from a service provider standpoint, from a community standpoint, from a other stakeholder standpoint, it's more understandable which direction we are going, and so you don't have instances where there is double or triple funding in an area because there's three different sets of rules for how that's supposed to be. And the FCC's new map is supposed to help solve some of this, and states are developing their own maps as well. But it is going to take some work to coordinate and organize all of these for sure.
Just let me ask you about the maps. I mean, there's been a lot of debate on that, and clearly, in order to allocate funding, you need to know what's available, right? And so there is this effort in going on in creating maps, and that's with the basic service provider data is a major source. Now, it used to be that service providers had to provide data already. But before, there was more of an incentive to, if anything, to say that you're doing better than usual. But now with the map, isn't there some sort of benefit to sort of reduce the amount of coverage so you can get more funding? I mean, granted that, well, obviously you need to rely on somebody to give you the data. You can't just.
Well, I think that's sort of a tactical call has been around for a while, because the balance is, well, at the end of the day, I think from what I do and what my perspective is I just want us as Nextlink to be putting accurate data out there. Like, where do we actually provide service? What speeds do we actually provide? But I have seen instances in the past where people will either overreport or underreport. But I think the challenge, if you underreport, then there's always the possibility that somebody else gets the funding because they can be a more efficient provider in that area. And then if you overreport, you are subjecting yourself to fines and other enforcement liability. But I will say, I think we have seen a dramatic improvement in the quality of data. Kind of to your point, Monica, we even just a few years ago, if there was a single household that was capable of being served within a census block, that entire census block was colored in as served. Now we have data that's down to the individual location and what service providers are saying they can do or not do at that particular location, which is a level of granularity that we have never seen before. And hats off to all of the folks who have been working on that to make that a reality. Is it ever going to be perfect? No. And I don't think people are continuing to deploy. New homes and businesses are continuing to be built. So it's never going to be perfect, but I think it's just an effort at continuous improvement, and we have seen so much improvement over the course of the past couple of years.
Yeah, and I guess that just the number of requests to fix it is a testament to the fact that it's being helpful and there is an improvement. And as you say, it's not trivial to see what is going on, and so I think that's overall good. Now, the issue of having different states deciding how to allocate funding sort of brings up another question, which is at a federal level, there's a certain amount of money that you allocate, and every state probably deserves something. But there are some states that are more rural or they have less coverage than others. So they well, do they deserve more in terms of, more funding given their amount, their number of the people living in there, the number of the extent of the rural population or whatever. So I guess what I'm saying is that where should we go? Or should we just give more money to states where it's cheaper to cover more people? So what should you maximize? The number of people you cover where they are? Do you want to be even so that somebody, regardless of the states, they have the same amount of, I mean, I think it's a very difficult question, and I don't know what, I mean, I tried to get an answer, but I don't see that there is any concerted policy in that.
Yeah, it's a tough one, and you can go a number of different directions. But the way that the Infrastructure Act went was every state gets 100 million, and the rest of your allocation is dependent on the number of a formula that takes into account the number of unserved locations and high cost unserved locations. So there was a formula developed that a number of folks are using to kind of make projections about which states are going to get what amounts of money based on what the FCC's maps are saying is the mix of served versus unserved versus underserved. I think there's still a little bit of work to be done to say what's considered to be a high cost and how that funding gets distributed. But at least for the BEAD program, there has been an effort made to allocate funding based on need, based on the number of unserved locations.
Okay, now let's get to Penn's question, which again is tied to something else a little bit broader I wanted to talk about. So he's asking if the technology definitions for rural broadband misread the industry away from emerging requirements. And he's thinking about 6G works. For instance, farmers might want to have positioning or services while they recover, IoT sensing for irrigations, fertilizer, and things like that. And should there be an emphasis on building that infrastructure? Now, my understanding is that kind of infrastructure will be more for cellular rather than for somebody like you guys. But that sort of brings the question of, is this a market that you see related to what you're doing? Or is it just like, well, that's the cellular guys, we do not want to deal with it?
No, I mean, absolutely. It's something that we are interested in and are focused on. I mean, as a provider in rural areas, being able to provide the kind of connectivity, particularly what Ken was talking about with agriculture uses, that's something that we are very heavily focused on and looking at the kinds of solutions that we can provide to be able to enable precision agriculture and all of the uses that Ken was talking about there. It is, and that's the beauty of wireless, right? Is you can enable those kind of solutions, whether it's fixed, whether it's mobile, you have wireless coverage over an area, and how you kind of choose to use that and cut that based on IoT, based on broadband, based on any other set of use cases, private LTE, those are the kind of the buzzwords that we get into. It's absolutely something that we look at and are actively providing in some of these contexts today.
Yeah, but do you think it should be part of the sort of like the funding for rural broadband should be included into that? Because it just seems like that's kind of it's sort of a separate type of funding. And I mean, I think it should be kept separate because, I guess that's where the complexity comes in, because if you lump everything together, then it makes it really difficult. So are you going to give money to a service provider that is going to provide coverage for residential users, or you give it to somebody that is doing some IoT? Then I think that sort of logically should be a different program, which is not to say that it doesn't deserve funding.
Oh, sure, absolutely, and that's the way that things have, to some extent, at least historically, been done. I mean, at the FCC, you have funding programs that are focused on schools and libraries, on telehealth, and then on high cost universal service for low income. So there is precedent for these bucketized approaches to addressing certain public policy goals, utilizing connectivity infrastructure, but with different goals in mind. And in some cases, the entities that are eligible for it and will benefit from it overlap, and in some cases they don't, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm surprised that nobody asked this, but I'm going to ask you, what about CBRS? Because I've heard from some service providers that they're starting to see some issues with interference. But on the other hand, it's also a very good band to use for fixed wireless access. What's your view on that?
We are huge fans of CBRS and want to see it continue. We don't really see, I mean, granted, we're largely a rural focused provider, so we don't see interference nearly as much as some folks who are in urban areas may. That has not been an issue for us. And we think the framework for CBRS is really fantastic, because it allows, kind of to the last point, right, for all of these different use cases to have access to effectively licensed spectrum for the very first time, which is why you saw in the course of the policymaking leading up to that, diverse arrays of stakeholders that were never involved in spectrum proceedings before, from ports to manufacturers to this, that, and the other, because they saw the benefit of sort of a smaller area license, hybrid license, generally authorized access framework. But we're big fans of it. We're lighting up probably about a Connecticut-sized chunk of landmass every month with CBRS spectrum, both the PALs and the GAA. So we're big believers in it, and we've seen fantastic results as a result of that.
Now, I just realized I want to ask you something else. So you're a service provider, you got all the funding you need, you're happy, ready to go, right? And it doesn't seem to be quite that simple, because you're ready to go, but then you need to deal with permissions, people that do the job. So can you tell us a little bit about what happens after you do get funding? Does it mean that life is perfect?
I mean, that's the big challenge, right? Is given the world that we live in today, even if you got funding a couple years ago, the cost to buy equipment, to get labor, all of that has gone up significantly over the course of the past few years as a result of inflation, and as a result of the focus on getting this kind of infrastructure out there. So it's not just about the funds, as you noted. It's about having a trained workforce able to do the deployment, the installation, the customer care. It's about that streamlined access to permitting, to where a permit may, in good cases, cost $0 to $100 or a couple $100, and you may get it in a month, as opposed to where it's thousands upon thousands of dollars and it takes you 9 months to a year to get it. Those definitely impact your ability to do the work that you were funded to do. So it's not just about, yay, we've got all the money we need. In some instances, it's the money that you got may not be enough to do all the things that you wanted to do, or you run into some of these other challenges that we were talking about. And I think that's particularly a challenge where we see historic levels of funding going into this market, both private and public capital. I think it's basic economics that when you open the funding sluice, then prices tend to go up. So the money doesn't go quite as far as you thought it would, which is, I think, some of the challenges that we see today.
Yeah, and I guess you can't just ask for more money predicting that. Otherwise, you get into this loop, and then it will never go. But I wish we could talk more about that, because this is something that we don't pay attention on the sort of like, okay, you get the funding, and now what? You cannot just get people to be right there doing what you need, have all the competencies, and then you're done, and they don't have a long-term job necessarily. Anyway, so Claude, thank you so much. This has been a great discussion, and I hope all of you in the audience enjoyed it too. So Kendra, over back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Monica. Thanks to our speakers for that great discussion, and thanks to our audience members for those comments and questions. And that will conclude our webinar for today. An on-demand version of today's debate will also be available at senseofeely.com in the coming days. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.